Hello, ma'am, attack the store. He's dying, ma'am.
They told me that they had been murdered. My first thought was of his family and his children.
I didn't have any information other than 3 masked males.
We were hoping that we would recognize the stature, the pace of these individuals.
He was not putting up any fight. The video was the #1 piece of evidence.
Look, we found your truck. I got your pickup on video.
"40-year-old store clerk Conbino Crasto, known as Bino to his friends, is busy at work.
Hey, Bino.
Hey, Dale, how are you?
Surviving.
I've known Bino since 2010. We got acquainted at the convenience store.
So, how are things in India?
Oh, good. Let me show you.
He was from the state of Goa, near the southern end of India. His main mission in life was to take care of his family there.
That's pretty good.
These are my boys.
Yeah,
He had a wife and 2 sons in India.
That's my youngest boy.
He would work here and send money home. Bino was devoted to his family and was excited about going back.
Hey, Sam.
How are you?
Good.
I met him at the gas station. We started talking like we knew each other for years. You walk in, he had a smile on your face. His smile made you smile.
Hi, Sam.
Bino was more than just a clerk. He was kind of the caretaker of that area where people needed something. Bino would help. He was such a caring, compassionate individual.
I think most of Cleveland became his chosen family. Regardless if he wanted us or not, we were going to be his family.
Hello, ma'am, this one attack the store. Send somebody.
Okay, the Cleveland Market?
Yeah, they stolen all the money. They shoot, I think. They shoot him.
They shot at you?
Yeah. Please
Bring the ambulance to that location.
send the ambulance. He's dying, ma'am.
I was on routine patrol. When the 911 call came through, a male who was shot at a local convenience store. I arrived on location.
Police department!
I observed a male standing behind the cash register area and another male lying on the ground, holding onto his chest.
The wounded man is the store's clerk, Conbino Crasto.
I tried my best to apply pressure over the wound. He was saying, I'm dying, I do not want to die. I have a family, I do not want to die.
EMS rushes Conbino to the hospital, while Detective Kevin Cook takes over the investigation.
When I arrived at the scene, I met with Sergeant Potter. We conducted a walkthrough of the scene to get a look at any potential evidence. There was a 9mm shell casing on the floor and blood stains behind the counter. My first impression was that it was an aggravated robbery. When I met with Avelino Fernandez, the store clerk witnessed in one of the patrol vehicles.
I'm Detective Cook with the police department. Can you tell me what happened here tonight?
He was visibly upset and crying, and he appeared to be very scared.
We in this one both are discussing the bill on the in this one registered.
He told me that he was working in the store with Gambino Crasto. Both the store clerks were behind the counter.
Suddenly, one man came with mask and gun. So he said, "Give money, give money."
One man by himself?
Yeah.
And he had a mask on?
Yeah, mask on. He came alone, and the back there is another two with mask.
Very shortly after, 2 more masked subjects were observed entering the store.
Even the first, he came, he said, give the money, otherwise I'll shoot you. He throws something. He just in center, go, he said. So then he shoot him. He cry and he fall down.
Stated that the subject threw the backpack at Gambino Crasto, and it was at the time that he threw the backpack, the suspect fired 1 shot.
Okay, and did the robber come around the counter and get the money?
Yeah, he came inside and he taken all the money. Told them, don't kill me, please, don't kill me, I beg him. And they walk away, not run.
I didn't have any information other than 3 masked males. My next step is to gain access to any surveillance video in this store.
There was a video surveillance camera behind the register and one in the lobby area, but we had no idea if it was actually functioning properly.
We have got to get that video, and we've got to get access to it as soon as possible.
The only one who was able to log into the system was the owner of the establishment. He was not on location. The next step is notify him as quickly as possible and have him en route.
While they wait for the store's manager, investigators search the exterior of the building.
We observed several coins on the front sidewalk of the store, just east of the store entrance. We followed the coin trail to the corner of the building, across the parking lot, across a ditch. The coin trail that led along the road to a point where we found a blue bandana laying on the road. That was collected as potential evidence. The coin trail definitely gave us an idea of a direction of travel. We knew that the suspects were traveling east, and there's a large neighborhood nearby. The coin trail led straight to the neighborhood. It was important to begin searching that neighborhood for anyone matching the description of the suspects and any potential home surveillance cameras.
While Conbino fights for his life in the hospital, the store manager arrives on scene and grants officers access to the CCTV.
We begin the search of the archives approximately 5 minutes before the call came into the police department.
Show me the inside camera.
I'm hoping to get a glimpse of one of the suspects' faces to help identify them. We started with the camera fixated on the front door. At 9:20 p.m., you see the suspect enter the store.
Freeze it there.
He's wearing a black jacket, tan pants, carrying a backpack and a handgun, and he's wearing distinctive latex gloves, wearing a blue bandana with a hoodie. So he's done a good job of concealing his identity.
Keep playing it.
A short time later, the second suspect walks in. He's wearing a gray hoodie, gray pants. He's also wearing a bandana over his face. We located one bandana on the roadway on the north side of the park, so that led us to believe that that bandana had been worn by one of the suspects. The third suspect, who is shorter in stature, is wearing gloves and a ski mask and a distinctive black and white checkered long sleeve shirt.
Okay, show me the rat camera behind the counter.
The armed suspect has approached the front counter and he's pointing his firearm at Mr. Crasto, and he's tossing a black backpack to Mr. Crasto.
Let's switch to the wider angle. Play that again.
Mr. Crasto takes the bag and essentially has his hands up and he's walking backwards. At that point, he was shot by the gunman. Cambino Crasto is lying on the floor bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest. He was not putting up any fight. He was not resisting the suspects in any way. It tells you that this gunman is reckless and he has no regard for human life. You see the store clerk witness go to the corner behind the counter and cower down.
He just witnessed his fellow employee get shot. He's probably in a state of shock. He starts complying and reaching into the cash register.
The gunman, you see him run behind the counter. The other two suspects stand in front of the counter. The taller of the three suspects in the gray hoodie with the purple stripes stands at the counter and is helping the gunman gather the money. Once the gunman gets the money from the register, he's observed running around the counter and essentially stepping over Mr. Crasto, and all three suspects are seen running out of the store.
Show me the other side camera.
And then running east along the sidewalk, which was consistent with the money trail that we saw.
Now you have three suspects. You know that one of them has a firearm and he's ready to use that firearm.
That's a dangerous person to just shoot someone that's unarmed and for no reason. We went back through the surveillance video to see if we could see anything that's helpful to identify the suspects.
Play that again. freeze it there.
The suspect is wearing black shoes with distinctive red shoelaces, which are something that stands out. They're different.
Look at that.
The gloves, the color of the gloves is distinctive.
Keep playing it. No gloves.
Suspect number 2 is not wearing any gloves. So we were able to identify suspect number 2 as a white male, tall, thin white male. We were able to get a good, accurate description of the suspects. That information was broadcast out to the officers in the field.
The hospital treating Conbino calls Detective Cook.
Go for Cook.
I was notified Mr. Cresto had passed away at the hospital. That now ramps the investigation up to capital murder.
Okay, I'll let everyone know.
He was just trying to make a living to provide for him and his family. I mean, what a heinous crime for a couple $100.
Now let's get to work.
Time is of the essence. It's important to try to locate these suspects as soon as possible.
My direction was to get as many officers in the areas as we could to prevent the escape of these individuals.
The coin trail led straight to the neighborhood known as Englewood. Several officers began canvassing that neighborhood, looking for any evidence or suspects. They're looking for the surveillance cameras along the eaves of the houses. Those are beneficial in capturing a direction of travel or possible suspect vehicle. Approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, we're notified by a Liberty County deputy that he has located a surveillance video on a residence on Jenny Street. He has had an opportunity to review the surveillance video from the resident.
Can you take it back to about 9 o'clock last night?
You're just scanning through it to see if you pick up any vehicles driving by or, anybody walking by.
Whoa.
Can you replay that?
He had located a vehicle that passed by that residence approximately 3 minutes after the time of the shooting.
Freeze right there.
The vehicle was a Chevrolet or GMC extended cab pickup, fairly old, but the unique thing about it was the suspension had been lowered and it didn't have aftermarket wheels on it. They were factory wheels. Although it is a black and white video, the way that the street light reflects off of the vehicle, you can tell that it's red in color. That was a unique truck that we could easily look for in the neighborhood.
You can take a picture of this really quick.
And it puts that particular vehicle in the area at the time of the shooting, so it's definitely a vehicle of interest.
As dawn breaks, officers step up their search.
At this point, we're looking for the red truck that was seen on the residential surveillance video.
Yeah.
I got a call from my partner. He had located a red extended cab pickup with lowered suspension parked in the front yard of a residence there. The vehicle was located probably 6 to 8 blocks from the store. It was obviously the same truck on the video. Just glanced around the bed of the truck and I saw loose change and the distinctive latex gloves. Also saw the gray hoodie with the purple stripes on it. I got excited and I said, man, that hoodie looks real familiar and those gloves are the same type of gloves we're looking for. There was definitely a chance that we could collect some DNA from those items. We made contact with the homeowner there.
Sir, we wanted to ask you, do you know anything about this truck?
He provided a lot of information. He stated that his wife's cousin, Robert Alvarado, was the owner of the vehicle. He had no knowledge that Robert Alvarado had parked that vehicle on his property, and he told us where Robert Alvarado was living.
As detectives head to Alvarado's home, officers break the news to Conbino's friends and family.
Hello? Yes. One of the law enforcement officers called me and told me that there had been a robbery and a murder. And I asked him, I said, was it Bino? And he said, yes. My first thoughts was of his family and his children. What would they do now? His cousin called and let family know what had happened. Think of them because none of us ever wanted to receive the telephone call.
As soon as I heard it, I just crumbled. How do you shoot somebody who's never done you wrong?
Detectives arrive at Robert Alvarado's residence.
He lived in a travel trailer. It was within eyesight of the store. And we make contact with Robert Alvarado and his father.
Can I ask you a few questions about it?
Sure. He'd seen what was going on at the store, which is like 200 yards away, and said that he went to that store all the time, and he knew all the clerks in there.
Okay, if we have a look inside. Go ahead, bro.
We didn't find any weapons or any of the clothing that would match the suspects in the video. Robert Alvarado was unusually nervous, so that raised our level of suspicion even more. So at that point, he was asked to come down to the police department for an interview. This is completely voluntary, okay? You're not under arrest. You're not being detained for any reason, okay? You're free to leave at any time. As a matter of fact, there's the door, okay? We asked him about his vehicle.
Where is your truck? What kind of truck are we talking about? Where is it at?
It's a Ford.
What color is it?
Oh, red.
Red?
Yeah. And my dad needs to get he's gonna fix it.
Stated that his vehicle was broke down and his father was a mechanic and the vehicle was at his father's shop getting worked on.
You're not being 100% because I got your truck. I got it. Okay? Your truck ain't never been down to your daddy's.
It was straight
No.
Robert Alvarado's father told us Robert Alvarado brought his truck to his mechanic shop, had it fixed, and then picked it up later that day. So it contradicted what Robert Alvarado had told us.
Look, I got your pickup on video. Look, you know you and your boys run out of there, and you drop money like a breadcrumb trail all the way out. We found your truck. Okay, we got it. over there in the neighborhood. There's evidence all in the truck of what went down. Right.
And in the truck.
Yeah.
He was confronted with the fact that we'd found the truck on Meadow Street, and then you really begin to see the physical indicators, the sweating and the stuttering.
No, it's not. The store was, you know where the store, bro. That scene is not me. Believe me, that scene is not me. I don't know what the hell happened in that scene.
What do you mean this scene is not you?
Where were you?
At the trailer.
The trailer since 7 o'clock. Look, bro.
That's the thing, the truck don't make sense.
Look, bro. I ain't doing anything. I wasn't even at the store. I was at the house, bro.
He denies having any involvement in the shooting at the country market.
But that wasn't me, man, for real. Keep telling yourself.
The fact that he's lying about where his truck's at, it tells me we're on the right track.
Okay. Good luck to you. Night off.
It's not probable cause to arrest him. We still had to put him at the scene.
Members of the community gathered to pay tribute to Conbino following his murder.
It was extremely overwhelming. People who came through and just showed up, even if they didn't have anything to give or anything to offer, just to show up and say, hey, we're sorry. It was just an outpouring of the whole community.
Nino's death was difficult for us, but he and I were very close. But I never forget, there's probably 200 or 300 other people out there that's in my same boots. They were all close to him, so it wasn't exclusive for me, and I know it touched everybody.
Still photos of the suspects from the surveillance videos are being distributed through social media. The officers have received the photos on their phones.
We were hoping that, being a small community, that we would recognize the stature, the walk, the pace of these individuals.
One of the patrol officers thought he recognized one of the suspects in the photos based on his physical description. Tall, very skinny. He saw it, and he had dealt with him a few days before when he was involved in a disturbance involving a red pickup. And he gave us the address of where we could find Michael Richardson. My partner and I drove to Michael Richardson's residence. Michael Richardson was an 18-year-old young man. Wasn't really on the radar of law enforcement.
Morning. My name is Detective Cook. This is Detective Shaver. Are you Mr. Michael Richardson?
Yeah.
We talked to him briefly and asked if he'd be willing to come down to the police department.
Yeah, sure. Let me grab a shirt.
So he walks to his back bedroom. My partner follows him back just to be safe. Michael Richardson was acting nervous after my partner observed some ammunition.
You got it? Take a look at this.
He's found a pair of black shoes with red shoelaces, a blue bandana that's consistent with what the suspect was wearing in the surveillance video. So at that point, Michael Richardson was transported down to Cleveland Police Department.
Why do you think you're here?
Because y'all know that I know someone that had something to do with it.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Because when Robert came to my house, he was wearing a black long sleeve shirt with a hoodie, and that's what they're wearing in that picture.
Okay. Robert who?
Alvarado.
Michael Richardson stated around 10 o'clock, Roberto Alvarado came back to his residence and asked him to hold some clothing.
Okay, and then he gave you what?
The shoes in the bag with a bandana.
A pair of black shoes with red laces, another pair of black boots, and a blue bandana. Those items of clothing were of interest to us because they matched the clothing in the surveillance video.
You have some more involvement than you're kind of laying out. You know that, and we know that.
Am I gonna get in trouble though?
Listen,
like
buddy.
if I just tell what happened?
We need to go get Robert before they hurt somebody else. Okay? You're the key to that.
Okay. Robert had come and got me, and then we went to that camper thing that he stays in. And he had this little gun and was pointing it around.
Let's go back a little bit to how when Robert came and picked you up at your house. What was he in?
He was in a red truck. Clock, and he started talking about doing some stupid crap about robbing the store. He started saying there's only one guy tonight. He said we would go up in there, no one would get hurt, we would be in and out. And then when we were in there, he was yelling at him, and then the one guy, he had grabbed the bag, the other guy that got shot, he grabbed the bag and was like slinging it at him. He was slinging it at him, and then he put it up against his, like this whenever he was trying to go to the bag, and then that's whenever Robert shot him.
He identifies Robert Alvarado as the shooter.
Investigators turned to the other suspect in the surveillance video.
Well, man, just speaking with us, you've helped us quite a bit. We gotta figure out who the third guy is.
I don't know.
Okay.
When someone tells you a story, they're very detailed to a point, and then they get real vague, and it's suspicious. So, you know, it was important to find out who he associated with that could possibly be suspect number 3. Once Michael Richardson confesses, he is placed under arrest, and he is subsequently charged with capital murder.
Following Richardson's confession, detectives also arrest Robert Alvarado for capital murder.
At this point, we have 2 suspects in custody. That led to now concentrating on the 3rd suspect with the gray and white plaid shirt and the black ski mask.
Investigators received tips of 2 people potentially connected to the shooting.
We received the name Cole Lincoln and Frank Hernandez as possible actors involved in the incident. Cole Lincoln arrived at the police department with his father. And I then conducted a voluntary interview with Cole Lincoln along with his parent.
I'm investigating a capital murder that occurred at a store here in town. Your name came up in the investigation. You know, there's a lot of finger pointing going on. I want to ask you, did you have any knowledge or any involvement in this robbery?
I might as well just straight up. Yes, I was there that night.
You were part of the robbery?
Yes.
Were you?
Yes.
What were you wearing?
I was wearing a black ski mask.
To be honest with you, I wasn't expecting the confession right then, and I don't believe his father was expecting it.
The truth's gonna come out sooner or later. crazy, man.
His father was visibly upset.
Cole's father leaves the room to recover.
Okay. You go to Michael's about 8?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Robert's truck is there.
Okay.
And as I walk up to the truck, he asks me, he said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "For what?" And he said, we're gonna hit the store.
Cole Lincoln went on to explain that a short time later, Frank Hernandez arrived at Michael Richardson's residence.
And so then we go to his house.
What house did y'all go to?
The trailer.
Okay.
He gave me a shirt, and he gave me gloves, the mask.
So what happened then? I mean, who all's at the trailer is what I need to know.
Me, Robert, Michael, and Frank.
Cole Lincoln went on to tell us that Roberto Alvarado gave him the ride up there to the park where he sat and watched the incident take place, and he then provided him with the transportation to leave the area, leave the scene.
It's obvious to us that Roberto's kind of the spearhead. He's providing clothes, vehicle. He was much more than just the getaway driver. And he's using these younger people to do his bidding so he doesn't have to do it directly.
Who had the gun?
Well, first Robert had it.
Okay. And then who had it after that?
Frank Hernandez.
He identified the shooter as Frank Hernandez.
Cole Lincoln is 15 years old. Police arrest him and place him in juvenile detention. Investigators confront Michael Richardson about Frank Hernandez's involvement in the murder.
It was at that point that Michael Richardson confirmed the story given by Cole Lincoln. He had made up the fact that Roberto Alvarado was the shooter.
And you didn't identify Frank Hernandez? Because I thought that if I could get Robert put in jail before any of the other ones, that he wouldn't be able to hurt me or anything.
Are you afraid of Robert Alvarado?
Yes.
Richardson confirms it was Frank Hernandez, not Robert Alvarado, who shot Conbino.
We now knew that Roberto Alvarado was the getaway driver, provider of the firearm, more or less the mastermind. Michael Richardson was suspect number 2, and Cole Lincoln was also involved as suspect number 3. We suspected that Frank Hernandez was the shooter. It then became priority for us to locate Frank Hernandez. Officers were able to locate Frank Hernandez at his residence. Hernandez was brought to Cleveland Police Department for questioning.
Okay, tell me what's going on.
Robert, he wanted us to look at the store.
Okay. What's a lick mean?
Just rob.
Rob the store to get the money? Okay. What happens inside the store? Walk me through the store. You're inside, you got the backpack. You said you put the backpack on the counter. I see the pistol come up. I see it come up. That's when you shot him? Yes or no? I can't hear you.
Yes, sir.
During the interview with Frank Hernandez, he confessed to his involvement.
So yes, so what did he do when you shot him?
He fell to them. He didn't shoot him.
You didn't mean to shoot him. But the reason you shot him, because you know what's behind there, the little push button to alert the cops, right? I mean, I know what's happening fast, bud, but you were scared. that he's gonna push the alarm? Yes or no? What? No. So you just cold-blooded shot him for no reason?
He seemed to have little care for what he had done.
Investigators arrest Frank Hernandez for capital murder. After his arrest, Hernandez directs them to the location of the pistol that shot Conbino.
Frank Hernandez, he told us where we could find the murder weapon. It happened to be on the same property where we recovered Roberto Alvarado's vehicle. The handgun was found in the backyard of the residence. It was a relief that we were able to recover the murder weapon and get all of the subjects involved in custody.
Frank Hernandez, Robert Alvarado, and Michael Richardson are all charged with capital murder. Cole Lincoln is charged as a minor. Witness testimony heard at the trials of Alvarado and Hernandez details the events that led to Conbino's murder.
Robert Alvarado was looking to be some sort of gang leader to younger, more impressionable kids. He came up with the idea to commit the aggravated robbery at the store. He felt that the store was an easy target because it was located on the edge of town, and he could recruit these kids to do it.
That is what happened. With the addition of, while the robbery was being committed, Frank Hernandez pulled the trigger and killed someone. Frank had some emotion, but Frank's emotion was for Frank, not about for what he had done. That was striking to me because he was only 17 years of age. And when I tie that back into what he did after he shot Conbino, stepping over him, completing the robbery, stepping back over him to leave, it told me a lot about Frank. It's kind of hard to imagine something that would be more callous than that. If these guys hold Conbino that they needed to borrow a couple $100, you probably would have gave it to him. But they took it, and they took his life for it.
The video was the #1 piece of evidence. It's unbiased. It tells the story like it happened. The video was critical. It was sad. I mean, these kids, 17 years old, convicted of capital murder, destroyed not only their lives, their families' lives, but they destroyed an innocent person's life, all for a little bit of money.
A group of us met at the American Legion and started doing a fundraiser to send money to Bino's wife and children. We wanted to make sure that the family knew how much we...
The salt-crusted air of Miami does not just carry the scent of the ocean. It carries the weight of 1,000 secrets buried beneath the relentless, unforgiving sun. In the sweltering heat of August 2004, the quiet, middle-class neighborhood of Coral Gables was a sanctuary of manicured lawns, blooming hibiscus, and the rhythmic sound of sprinklers marking the passage of long, lazy afternoons. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by their pets' names, where the local park was a hive of activity for young families, and where the most pressing issue of the day was the approaching hurricane season. That illusion of suburban perfection was incinerated on the night of August 14th, when Elena Rodriguez, a bright, 20-year-old nursing student, vanished while walking home from a late-night shift at the hospital. She had called her mother to say she was just blocks away, her voice light and full of plans for the upcoming semester, but the line went dead, replaced by the mechanical, hollow tone of a disconnected call that signaled the end of her life. The search began at dawn, with the police combing the palm-lined streets, their flashlights cutting through the thick, tropical darkness as they looked for any sign of a struggle, a discarded purse, or a footprint in the sand. But Miami is a city that breathes, expands, and erases its own history with terrifying speed, and within 48 hours, the trail had gone ice cold. No witnesses came forward, no suspicious vehicles were reported, and the heavy, humid silence of the neighborhood seemed to swallow the tragedy whole, leaving only the hollow, echoing grief of a family that refused to stop searching, even when the rest of the world had moved on. For 2 decades, the disappearance of Elena Rodriguez became a ghost story that haunted the local precinct, a jagged, broken piece of the city's heart that refused to mend. The initial investigation had been plagued by the chaotic, swirling nature of a city that was constantly transforming, where transient populations and the relentless churn of tourist traffic made it impossible to track anyone for long. The detective assigned to the case, a man who had grown gray and weary under the weight of 100 unsolved files, spent his retirement obsessing over the grainy photos of Elena's last known location, staring at the empty spaces in the CCTV footage, trying to find a face, a license plate, or a shadow that shouldn't have been there. The case grew into a mountain of paper, filled with thousands of interviews, discarded leads, and the desperate, heartbreaking cries of a mother who stood on the corner every anniversary, holding a poster that was fading under the relentless Florida sun. The community, initially paralyzed by the fear that a predator was lurking in their shadows, eventually allowed the terror to calcify into a grim, unspoken acceptance. The case was archived, then reopened, then buried under the bureaucratic debris of newer, bloodier crimes, until it became nothing more than a footnote in the digital database of the Miami-Dade Police, a cold case that the department had resigned themselves to never solving. The truth did not come from a breakthrough in forensic technology or a miraculous piece of evidence recovered from a forgotten storage locker. It came from the final, whispered breath of a man who could no longer bear the weight of his own conscience. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit wing of a hospice center on the outskirts of the city, a man named Hector Vance, a 70-year-old former handyman with a history of minor property crimes and a reputation for keeping to himself, lay dying of end-stage liver failure. As the machines beeped in the rhythmic, haunting cadence of a life ticking down to zero, Vance summoned the attending nurse, his voice a jagged, rasping sound that barely cut through the silence of the room. He spoke of a house on Maple Avenue, a house he had worked on during the summer of 2004, and of a backyard that held more than just overgrown weeds and broken garden furniture. His confession was not poetic or filled with remorse. It was a clinical, matter-of-fact recitation of a nightmare that had been festering in the dark corners of his mind for 20 years. He described how, on that humid August night, he had been operating in a state of dissociative rage, how he had seen the young girl walking alone, and how the impulse had seized him with the force of a tidal wave. He led the investigators, through the nurse who acted as his conduit to the law, to the exact location beneath a massive, sprawling oak tree where he had claimed to have buried the evidence that would finally bring the truth into the light. When the excavation team arrived at the address on Maple Avenue, the residents, who had bought the house long after the crime had occurred, watched in stunned, pale-faced horror as the police began to tear up the carefully landscaped garden. The air was thick with the smell of overturned earth and the suffocating tension of a long-buried secret being exhaled into the open. The neighborhood, once a bastion of peace, became a crime scene of chilling proportions, with the white, forensic tents standing like ghostly sentinels over the hole that was deepening with every shovelload of dirt. The detectives worked with a meticulous, slow-motion precision, their hearts hammering against their ribs as they uncovered the layers of the past, the earth giving up items that were still recognizable despite the years. A piece of jewelry, a scrap of fabric, and then the final, undeniable proof of a young life cut short. The revelation that the killer had been a man who had walked through their backyards, fixed their fences, and interacted with their families while carrying the knowledge of a brutal murder in his soul sent a shockwave of nausea through the community. The news traveled through the streets faster than a tropical storm, and soon the site was swarming with reporters, the flashing lights of their cameras creating a surreal, strobe-like effect against the dark, disturbed earth. The aftermath of the confession turned the city into a theater of collective trauma, as the residents of Coral Gables were forced to confront the reality that they had been living, breathing, and raising their children in the immediate proximity of a monster. Every neighbor who had ever hired Vance to fix a leaking roof or paint a porch started to question their own perceptions, searching their memories for a twitch, a stare, or a comment that should have been a red flag. The police station was flooded with calls from people who had seen him at their homes, their voices trembling as they recounted innocuous interactions that suddenly felt sinister. The case file, once a tomb of unanswered questions, was now a blueprint of a lifelong predator who had used the mundanity of his profession to navigate the city with complete, horrifying invisibility. The detectives worked day and night to cross-reference his work schedule, his past addresses, and his history of employment, realizing that a man with his level of access could have left a trail of bodies across the entire county, his crimes hidden behind the facade of a harmless, older man who was just trying to make a living. As the forensic team processed the remains, the family of Elena Rodriguez experienced a grief so sharp and so complicated that it felt like a second, deeper kind of mourning. They had lived for 20 years in the vacuum of not knowing, a state of purgatory where hope and despair had been locked in a permanent, grinding battle, and now they were forced to stare into the face of a truth that was even more horrifying than their worst fears. They sat in the quiet, shadowed rooms of their home, surrounded by the photos of a daughter who would never age, as the news detailed the gruesome particulars of her final moments. The community, once united in their search, now fragmented into a sea of anger, sadness, and an intense, burning need to understand how such a monster could have existed in their midst for so long. The local churches held vigils that were more like funerals than prayers, the atmosphere heavy with the scent of incense and the sound of sobbing, as people lit candles for a girl they had failed to protect and for a neighborhood that had lost its innocence in a single, earth-shattering afternoon. The legal process that followed the discovery was a whirlwind of motion, as the prosecution scrambled to build a case that could finally deliver justice for a crime that had technically occurred 2 decades earlier. Vance, in his final days, was held under guard in the hospital, his world reduced to the 4 walls of his room and the constant, probing presence of detectives who were desperate to extract every detail of his criminal history before he slipped away. The lawyers argued over the viability of the case, the admissibility of his deathbed confession, and the implications of the physical evidence, but the truth was too heavy, too concrete to be argued away. Every piece of evidence they uncovered from the backyard, the twisted metal, the disintegrated remains, was a testament to a cruelty that had been allowed to fester because the town had been too distracted, too trusting, and too comfortable to look closer at the shadows that moved among them. The detectives who had spent their entire careers dreaming of this moment now found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer, industrial scale of the horror they had uncovered, their sense of closure tainted by the knowledge that the man who had done this had been walking free, under their noses, for the duration of the entire investigation. As the trial, or what remained of it, was prepared, the city's consciousness was irrevocably altered, the landscape of their daily lives forever tainted by the geography of the crime. The house on Maple Avenue was abandoned, the property value plummeted, and the backyard was left a barren, scorched patch of ground that served as a visceral, visual reminder of the darkness that had been unearthed. People stopped walking their dogs at night, the neighborhood parks were emptied of their usual, vibrant crowds, and the casual, friendly trust that had defined their community was replaced by a guarded, watchful suspicion. The case became a permanent, chilling reference point for the city, a story that was told to teenagers to keep them safe, a cautionary tale that reminded everyone that danger didn't always arrive in a loud, dramatic explosion. Sometimes, it arrived in the form of a man with a toolbox, a quiet manner, and a heart full of unimaginable, predatory silence. The forensic analysis of the remains yielded details that were too graphic for the public to endure, and the detectives struggled to keep the details of Vance's history a secret until the formal charges could be presented. They discovered a hidden cache of items in his old shed, things that he had collected like trophies, a hair ribbon, a broken watch, a single, mismatched earring, the remnants of lives he had claimed and then discarded like refuse. The realization that Elena was not his only victim, that there was a trajectory of destruction that spanned his entire working life, caused the police to expand the investigation to a statewide level, with every unsolved missing person report from the last 20 years being reassessed through the lens of Vance's movements and his history of labor. The city was a grid of fear and investigation, with every old house, every overgrown yard, and every remote stretch of road becoming a potential site of a crime that had been committed in the blind spot of a world that had been looking the other way. The culmination of the case came with the death of Hector Vance, who passed away in the hospital just days after his full, comprehensive confession was recorded, his final act being the destruction of the illusion that had kept him safe for so long. He died without ever facing the inside of a courtroom, without ever having to look into the eyes of Elena's mother, and without ever having to justify the monstrous life he had led, leaving the justice system to grapple with the hollow, frustrating reality of a culprit who had escaped the ultimate penalty of the law. The legal team was left to process the estate, to document the final, lingering truths of his life, and to provide the family with as much closure as the cold, sterile reality of a deathbed confession could offer. The case was formally closed, the file was placed in the archives, and the neighborhood attempted to move on, but the shadow of the backyard, the oak tree, and the man with the toolbox remained a permanent, invisible resident of the area, a reminder that the past is never truly buried. It is only waiting for the soil to be disturbed. Today, the backyard on Maple Avenue is a vibrant, carefully manicured space again, with new owners who have planted a garden that overflows with color and light, trying to scrub the soil of the memory of what once lay beneath. They hold parties, they invite their friends over, and they enjoy the warm, golden Miami sun, choosing to believe that the ground has been purified by time and the simple act of living. But every now and then, when the wind kicks up or the rain washes the topsoil away, the residents of Coral Gables look at the earth with a different kind of respect, a quiet, grounded acknowledgement that beneath their feet lies a history that was once a nightmare. The case of Elena Rodriguez remains a beacon of the fragility of safety, a testament to the persistence of grief, and a harrowing look at the darkness that can flourish in the light of an ordinary day, leaving the community to find their own way to exist in a world where the secrets of the dead are sometimes the only things that truly stay awake. The shadow cast by Hector Vance did not vanish with his final breath. Rather, it lengthened, stretching across the entire architectural history of Miami-Dade County. As the excavation of the Maple Avenue property concluded, the sheer, logistical nightmare of the investigation began to unfold. Detectives realized that they were not merely investigating one murder, but systematically deconstructing a decades-long career of predatory violence that had been hiding in plain sight, masked by the mundane, dust-covered work boots of a general handyman. The forensic team, moving with the slow, agonizing precision of archaeologists, began to catalog the secondary items recovered from the debris layer beneath the oak tree. These were not just remnants of Elena Rodriguez. They were fragments of lost identities, personal effects that had been stored away in plastic bags and buried deep enough to escape the reach of time. Among the recovered items were a digital watch with a cracked face, a silver charm bracelet that had lost its luster, and a leather wallet that had been partially dissolved by the acidic Florida soil. Each item was a narrative in itself, a cold, hard piece of evidence that spoke of lives violently interrupted, and as the detectives cross-referenced these items with missing persons reports from the late 90s and early 2000s, the scope of Vance's depravity began to expand with chilling, exponential speed. The local media, initially gripped by the sensational nature of the deathbed confession, quickly pivoted to a deeper, more investigative approach as they began to interview Vance's former employers. The picture that emerged was that of a man who was almost aggressively ordinary. He was never the loudest man in the room. He was never the one to offer an opinion or demand attention. He was, by all accounts, the perfect handyman, punctual, quiet, and exceptionally thorough. He had keys to hundreds of homes across the city, access to garage codes, and a professional license that allowed him to move through gated communities without drawing a single glance from security. The detectives learned that he had worked on over 50 homes in the immediate radius of Elena Rodriguez's neighborhood, and as they cross-referenced this map of employment with the geography of unsolved cold cases, the Reddits began to populate the grid with a terrifying, undeniable symmetry. The realization that he had been standing in the kitchens and living rooms of potential victims, observing their habits, measuring their vulnerabilities, and perhaps even holding the very tools that would later be used to silence them, sent a wave of visceral, cold-blooded paranoia through the city. The police department, now under immense pressure from the mayor's office and the outraged families of other long-missing young women, established a dedicated task force known as the Vance Inquiry. It was a massive, cross-jurisdictional effort that required the cooperation of local, state, and federal authorities to sort through the gargantuan volume of paper records that Vance had left behind. They combed through 20 years of his tax returns, his phone bills, and his list of clients, looking for the telltale signs of a man who was living a dual existence. They found that he had maintained a storage unit in a remote part of the city, a place he hadn't visited in years, but which contained a meticulously organized collection of newspaper clippings regarding his own crimes. He had been tracking the progress of the investigations into his own victims, keeping score, and perhaps even fueling the fires of the search by occasionally calling in anonymous, misleading tips to police hotlines. The sheer, calculated coldness of this practice, a man participating in the hunt for his own prey, was a psychological revelation that haunted the investigators, changing their perception of the killer from a man driven by sudden, uncontrollable rage to a man fueled by a sustained, sociopathic hunger. As the inquiry deepened, the detectives turned their focus toward the social circles that Vance had orbited. They discovered that he was a fixture in certain local dive bars and community centers, places where he would sit for hours, listening to the gossip of the city, learning the routes of the young women who worked late, and scouting for those who lacked the support networks to be missed quickly. It was a strategy of predatory observation, a systematic analysis of the urban landscape that allowed him to move through Miami without ever leaving a trail. The people who had known him, or thought they had, were brought in for questioning, their memories sifted and analyzed. One woman, who had dated Vance for a brief, 6-month period in 2005, described him as a man of deep, inexplicable silences. She recalled how he would sometimes disappear for hours, returning with his clothes stained in a way he could never explain, and how he had an unsettling fixation on the soil composition of the gardens he worked on. Her testimony, given in the stark, echoing halls of the station, provided the most intimate glimpse into the mind of the man who had turned Coral Gables into a graveyard, painting a portrait of a lonely, hollowed-out soul who found his only purpose in the cold, transactional act of ending a life. The forensic laboratory was working around the clock to reconcile the remains from the Maple Avenue property with the list of missing persons that had been consolidated by the task force. The DNA testing was grueling, as the environmental factors had rendered much of the biological evidence fragile and prone to contamination. Each match required the approval of multiple independent labs, a process that took weeks of nerve-wracking, high-stakes verification. When the second match was confirmed, a young woman who had disappeared while on her way home from the university in 1999, the city felt the floor drop out from under it. The confirmation proved that Vance had been operating as a serial offender for at least 5 years before he even touched Elena Rodriguez. It suggested that there were potentially dozens of other victims, hidden under the roots of other trees, beneath the floorboards of other sheds, or in the forgotten corners of other backyards that had long since been paved over by the unstoppable momentum of Miami's development. The inquiry began to coordinate with historical maps, looking for areas where land had been cleared or construction had occurred in the late 90s, searching for any anomalies that might hint at a history that had been deliberately erased. The psychological burden on the detectives assigned to the task force began to manifest in a variety of ways. Several members of the team had to be rotated off the assignment, their morale shattered by the constant exposure to the details of a crime and the overwhelming frustration of a case that was fundamentally built on the wreckage of a life that was already over. They had to deal with the families of the victims, who were now holding vigils not just for the girls who had been found, but for the possibility that their own loved ones might be part of the Vance collection. The task force set up a dedicated counseling center for these families, but even that was not enough to address the trauma of a community that was effectively under siege by its own past. The city became a place where every backyard renovation was viewed with suspicion, and where the sight of a general contractor's truck in a residential driveway was enough to trigger a wave of unease that rippled through the entire neighborhood. In the midst of all this, the question of Vance's motivation remained the most persistent and infuriating riddle of the investigation. Why had he done it? What had he gained from the silent, methodical destruction of these young lives? The detectives, assisted by FBI behavioral experts, attempted to build a profile that could explain his behavior, but the answers were always elusive. Vance had not been motivated by money, nor by political power, nor by a discernible, external grievance. He appeared to be a man for whom the act of murder was a self-contained experience, a way to impose his will upon the world in a way that left no room for resistance. He was a man who lived in the margins of society and found his power in the shadows, a man who saw the fragility of others and decided that he would be the force that broke them. The detectives found diaries in his old apartment, not real diaries, but collections of notes, sketches, and maps that he had compiled over the years. They were blueprints of his life, filled with the names of his victims and the locations where he had buried his secrets, but they lacked any kind of commentary or emotional introspection. They were simply a record of his movements, a ledger of his crimes, written with the mechanical, unfeeling precision of a man tracking the progress of an inventory. As the inquiry continued, the task force began to identify potential sites where Vance might have buried other victims. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan parks, woods, and private properties, looking for the telltale disruptions in the soil that indicated human remains. The work was painstaking, often yielding nothing but old animal bones or discarded construction materials, but every negative result was a source of its own kind of pain, the pain of a family that was still waiting, still hoping, and still dreading the day the truth might finally arrive. The Miami-Dade Police Department started an online portal where people could view the items that had been recovered from Vance's storage unit, the jewelry, the clothing, the trinkets, in the hope that a member of the public might recognize a piece of their own history. The response was overwhelming. People called in from all over the country, some identifying items that had belonged to their daughters, their sisters, or their friends, bringing a new, fresh layer of agony to an investigation that was already drowning in it. The city's legal system was also being tested in unprecedented ways. The prosecution had to navigate the complexities of trying a man who was already dead, a situation that left the families of the victims without the satisfaction of a public trial or a sentencing hearing. They were forced to present their findings in a series of highly publicized press conferences, explaining the details of Vance's life, his crimes, and the evidence they had collected, but the lack of a live defendant meant that there was no one to answer for the suffering he had caused. It was a situation that felt inherently unjust, a final insult to the families who had endured decades of uncertainty only to be denied the resolution of a final, public confrontation. The lawyers worked tirelessly to document the case, to ensure that the facts were etched into the public record in a way that could never be challenged or forgotten, but they understood that for many, this was not enough. The law is a system designed to punish the living, not to memorialize the dead, and the lack of a living subject meant that justice would always remain an abstract, incomplete concept in the face of such absolute, irreversible loss. As the task force began to wind down its operations, the final report, a document of nearly 3,000 pages, was submitted to the district attorney. It was a comprehensive, harrowing account of a serial predator who had used the mundanity of his life as a mask for a career of murder that spanned decades. The report served as a definitive, unvarnished history of the case, documenting every site, every victim, and every secret that had been uncovered during the investigation. But as the investigators packed up their boxes and prepared to move on to their next assignments, there was a sense of profound, lingering incompleteness. They had found the truth, they had documented the horror, and they had provided a measure of closure for the families who had been waiting for the longest time, but they had not been able to fix what had been broken. The city was still Miami, and the memories were still there, and the backyards were still just patches of ground that held the secrets of a past that would never truly be buried. The Vance inquiry had uncovered the monster, but it hadn't stopped the shadows from being shadows, and as the detectives walked out of the precinct one last time, they carried with them the heavy, permanent knowledge that in every city, in every neighborhood, there are secrets that are only waiting for the soil to be disturbed to reveal their own dark, hidden truths. The final phase of the investigation also turned its attention to the institutional failures that had allowed Vance to escape notice for so long. The task force interviewed dozens of individuals who had been involved in the original 2004 investigation, searching for any signs of negligence or deliberate suppression. They discovered that while there had been no overt conspiracy to protect Vance, there had been a culture of complacency and a lack of resources that had made his crimes almost easy to commit. The police had been stretched thin, the city had been focused on the rapid growth of the tourist economy, and the disappearance of a single nursing student had been treated as an unfortunate, singular event that didn't warrant the kind of deep, systemic investigation that might have identified Vance as a serial predator. It was a systemic failure that had been enabled by the very nature of Miami, a city that prioritized the future over the past, the new over the old, and the visible over the hidden. The report recommended a series of reforms, including the creation of a permanent cold case unit and the implementation of better digital record-keeping practices, but the detectives understood that these were small, administrative fixes for a fundamental problem of human perception. You cannot legislate curiosity, and you cannot mandate the kind of deep, systemic empathy that is required to truly see the lives that are being lost in the margins of society. In the end, the Vance inquiry was a testament to the persistence of the human spirit in the face of absolute, unmitigated darkness. The detectives, the forensic scientists, and the families of the victims had all come together to do the work that should have been done 20 years ago, and in doing so, they had managed to construct a narrative of justice that was built on the foundation of their own resilience. The backyard on Maple Avenue, once a site of terror, had been transformed into a place of scientific investigation, and the secrets of the dead had been spoken aloud by the people who had refused to let them remain silent. The case of Hector Vance and Elena Rodriguez would be remembered not just for the horror of the crime, but for the struggle to bring it into the light, and for the way that the entire community had finally been forced to confront the presence of the shadows that had been moving among them all along. The file was closed, but the memory of the search, the long, cold hours in the lab, the tense, silent moments in the tent in the backyard, and the tearful, broken reunions in the quiet rooms of the homes of the survivors, remained etched into the consciousness of the city, a permanent, indelible record of a journey into the heart of a darkness that had almost succeeded in remaining hidden forever. As the Miami sun continued to rise and set, casting its light on the streets, the parks, and the gardens, the city returned to its rhythm of life, but it was a life that was now informed by the knowledge that the ground beneath their feet was a map, and that in the silence of the backyard, there was always a secret waiting to be heard. The formal indictment of Hector Vance, even as a posthumous legal entity, transformed the Suffolk County Courthouse into a crucible of historical reckoning, forcing a deeply conservative community to look back at every interaction, every repair job, and every neighborhood acquaintance through a lens of profound, agonizing horror. The legal machinery of the state of Florida, acutely aware of the explosive nature of the case, moved with a calculated, cold efficiency that mirrored the forensic science that had finally cracked the casing of a 36-year lie. In the weeks leading up to the preliminary evidentiary hearings, The state attorney's office became a fortress of secrets, with prosecutors working alongside the Miami-Dade Cold Case Task Force to catalog a mountain of newly discovered evidence that threatened to implicate more than just the man who had died in the sterile solitude of a hospice wing. The shockwaves from the discovery of the secondary burial sites across the city had created an immediate crisis of faith, not only in the divine, but in the very systems of local government and law enforcement that had allowed a systematic predator to reign supreme for over 2 decades. As investigators meticulously charted Hector Vance's timeline from the early 1990s through the mid-2000s, they began to uncover a chilling, rhythmic pattern of geographic movements that aligned perfectly with several other unresolved disappearances across the state. The realization that Coral Gables might not have been a singular, isolated tragedy, but rather the epicenter of a serial predator's expansive, multi-county hunting ground, brought a wave of federal investigators into the county, their dark suits and unmarked vehicles cutting through the vibrant, palm-lined landscape like a visible, jagged stain. Every single house Vance had repaired, every fence he had constructed, and every garden he had tended was cross-referenced with regional missing persons databases, revealing a terrifying reality. The handyman had used his professional mobility and the absolute, unquestioning trust of the public to navigate the arterial highways of South Florida completely unmonitored. He was a man who possessed the ultimate alibi. He was always just doing the work, always just fixing a roof, always just maintaining a property, all while leaving a trail of absolute destruction buried deep beneath the surface of the very lives he was supposedly helping to stabilize. Inside the Miami-Dade Evidence Repository, Hector Vance's collection of trophies was a prisoner of absolute inventory, sitting on sterile metal shelves that mocked the chaotic, visceral nature of the items themselves. Detectives had categorized the hundreds of personal effects recovered from his storage units and buried sites: a silver locket, a cracked wristwatch, a pair of worn sneakers, a collection of photographs taken from a distance. The prosecutors knew that a traditional trial would have been a battleground of character and motive, but they were now preparing for a comprehensive, judicial exhibition of guilt. They sought to frame the entire investigation not as a tragedy of a single, lost soul, but as a systematic failure of community oversight. They aimed to dismantle the myth of the harmless old handyman and replace it with a clinical, forensic profile of a sociopath who had leveraged the mundanity of his own existence to hide in plain sight. But while the lawyers argued over chain of custody protocols and the admissibility of the deathbed confession in closed-door chambers, the cultural landscape of Miami was undergoing a violent, irreversible mutation. The house on Maple Avenue, once a proud architectural representative of the quiet suburban dream, was declared a secondary crime scene, its manicured lawn cordoned off by miles of heavy-duty yellow police tape that flapped in the hot Florida wind like a warning flag. Forensic teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar and chemical enhancement sprays spent weeks inside the yard, dismantling the landscape, overturning the soil, and searching the extensive properties for any sign that the handyman's buried secrets weren't the only ones he had hidden on private ground. The image of federal agents digging into the lawns of pristine estates, while former clients watched from the perimeter in stunned, weeping silence, became the defining image of the city's absolute, shattered sense of security. The psychological toll on the surviving family members of the victims was immense, a volatile mixture of long-delayed vindication and a reopening of wounds that had barely begun to scar over. Elena Rodriguez's brother, David, who had been a teenager when his sister vanished, found himself thrust into the media spotlight, forced to speak for a family that had been systematically hollowed out by grief. In his public statements, delivered from the steps of the courthouse, David did not hold back his fury, directing his anger not just at Hector Vance, but at the entire cultural apparatus that had protected the handyman while ignoring the desperate cries of his family. He revealed that after Elena's disappearance, Vance had frequently visited their home, performing minor repairs, accepting payment with a quiet, polite nod, and using his position as a trusted neighborhood worker to stay informed about the police investigation, effectively steering the narrative away from himself whenever the detectives seemed to get too close to the truth. This revelation, that the killer had used his proximity to the victims to actively suppress the investigation under the guise of professional maintenance, sent a shudder of pure, cold revulsion through the community, turning even his most staunch, former employers into fierce adversaries. The local newspapers, which had spent decades printing advertisements for Vance's home repair services, began publishing scathing, investigative exposés detailing how he had systematically isolated anyone who questioned his movements or his background. Former clients, suddenly freed from the internal shame of having hired a monster, came forward with stories of strange, unsettling interactions, of Vance lingering in the yard long after the work was done, of his intense, predatory focus on the young daughters of his employers, and of his uncanny ability to anticipate the schedules of the households he served. It became blindingly clear that Hector Vance had built a fortress of absolute, invisible power specifically designed to withstand the scrutiny of the law, a fortress that had held firm until a single, failing liver and a flickering, dying conscience shattered its foundation. As the date for the evidentiary hearing approached, the atmosphere in the county seat grew so volatile that the state requested a heavy law enforcement presence to maintain order, anticipating massive protests from both sides of the fractured community. The defense's strategy of challenging the deathbed confession began to falter as the prosecution filed a series of comprehensive briefs detailing the absolute, physiological consistency of the information Vance had provided, information that only the perpetrator could have known. The state was not merely presenting a confession. They were presenting a map of horrors so definitive that to deny it would be to deny the fundamental laws of investigative success itself, leaving the estate's legal representatives with very few options other than to attack the character of the long-dead victims or suggest a conspiracy of impossible, illogical proportions. The true weight of the horror, however, lay in the contents of the hidden storage unit, which the prosecution fought fiercely to introduce into the record despite intense objections from the defense team. The Polaroids, which had been subjected to rigorous, high-resolution digital enhancement by the Miami-Dade Police Department's Cybercrimes Unit, provided an undeniable, chronological record of Hector Vance's depravity, capturing not just the final moments of his victims' lives but the absolute, calculated coldness of a man who viewed his victims as mere property to be catalogued and kept. The detail that emerged from these images, the stark, rustic interior of the handyman's shed, the terrifying clarity in the victim's eyes, and the shadow of the photographer casting a long, dark silhouette across their bodies, shattered any remaining doubt about the handyman's culpability, turning the upcoming judicial exhibition from a question of if he committed the crimes to a question of how many more times he had done it in the dark, silent corners of Miami. The small-town infrastructure of Coral Gables was completely overwhelmed by the influx of national media, with satellite trucks lining the streets and true crime journalists setting up temporary studios in the local motels, turning the historic square into a brightly lit stage for a national tragedy. The residents found themselves living in a fishbowl, their private grief and collective shame broadcast to millions of screens around the world, casting their city as a cautionary tale of blind trust and the dangers of the hidden predator. The local business owners, who had spent their lives building a quiet, respectable community, watched in dismay as their neighborhood became synonymous with a gothic, southern horror story, a place where a monster had worn a cap and carried a toolbox for 2 decades while the world looked on in disbelief. Yet, amid the chaos and the anger, a quiet, resilient movement began to take root among the younger generation of Miami residents who refused to let their city be entirely defined by the actions of a single, quiet man. They organized vigils not for the neighborhoods, but for Elena and all the other forgotten victims of cold cases across the state, using the tragedy as a catalyst to demand greater transparency, better funding for local forensic departments, and an end to the culture of silence that had protected predators in power, or in utility trucks, for far too long. They understood that the healing of Miami could not begin until the full, unvarnished truth was dragged into the light, no matter how painful that truth might be, and no matter how many sacred neighborhood trusts had to be dismantled in the process. Inside the courtroom, as the judge finally took the bench to open the preliminary proceedings, the silence that fell over the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to compress the decades of waiting into a single, breathless moment. Hector Vance was long dead, but his presence was felt in every page of the indictment, his actions laid bare in the testimony of the detectives who had chased his shadow for half a lifetime. The prosecutor stood, cleared his voice, and began to read the formal charges, his words echoing through the chamber like a tolling bell, marking the definitive end of a 36-year lie and the beginning of a long, painful march toward an unyielding, absolute justice that would finally allow the victims to rest in the soil of their own home. The sheer, industrial scale of the concealment sent a wave of nausea through the prosecution team, confirming their worst suspicions that Elena Rodriguez had been the victim of a man who had treated his criminal activities with the same meticulous attention to detail that he applied to the construction of a backyard deck. The detail that emerged from the digging, the reinforced concrete foundations, the deep, secondary burial shafts, and the way the garden had been designed to discourage any kind of deep excavation, suggested that Vance had not just committed a murder. He had built a comprehensive, logistical infrastructure designed to fund his concealment, using the income from his repair jobs to pay for the materials, the equipment, and the maintenance of his private chambers of horrors. The realization that their hard-earned money, given in faith to support the work of a handyman, had been directly utilized to maintain the logistics of a murder investigation sent a shockwave of financial and moral outrage through Coral Gables. Class action lawsuits were initiated by former clients seeking to recover the fees they had paid to Vance, paralyzing his estate's ability to pay for any posthumous legal defense team and forcing the representatives to reconsider their long-term strategy. The defense team, recognizing that the estate's financial pipeline was rapidly drying up and that the public sentiment had turned into an unyielding wall of hostility, began to quietly explore the possibility of a non-contest plea, hinting to the prosecution that they would not fight the evidentiary record if the state would agree to a formal, public acknowledgement of the victims' identities as the final, binding chapter of the case. This backdoor political maneuvering, however, was met with fierce resistance from both the district attorney and the Rodriguez family, who demanded nothing less than a full, public exhibition where every detail of the handyman's depravity would be aired before the community. David Rodriguez made it explicitly clear in a series of emotional meetings with law enforcement that his family would not accept a compromise that allowed the killer to control the narrative one last time, stating that they had already waited 36 years for justice and would rather risk a lengthy, exhausting judicial exhibition than allow Vance to bargain with the bones of their sister. The prosecution echoed this sentiment, confident that the combination of the forensic soil analysis, the recovered trophies, and the deathbed confession constituted an airtight case that no defense attorney, regardless of their skill or reputation, could successfully dismantle. As the legal teams prepared their final motions, the physical reality of Hector Vance's isolation in the hospice facility during his final days began to take on a new, grim significance. Stripped of his tools, his anonymity, and the constant, quiet routine of his daily work, he seemed to dwindle into a hollowed-out vessel of confessed malice, his voice losing its quiet, resonant quality during his final, recorded interviews. The detectives who monitored his final hours reported that he spent his nights pacing the small, clinical space of his hospital room, occasionally muttering fragments of his past deeds to the bare walls, his mind seemingly trapped in a loop of his own historical deceptions. The mask of the elegant, untouchable handyman had been completely dissolved, leaving behind a cold, frightened old man who was finally realizing that the modern world had bypassed his defenses and was about to demand a full accounting for the blood on his hands. The broader cultural impact of the Coral Gables case began to influence other law enforcement agencies across the Deep South, prompting a regional re-examination of cold cases involving young women who had disappeared near rural maintenance jobs or residential service calls during the late 1990s. The Miami-Dade Police Department established a dedicated multi-agency database specifically to map Hector Vance's historical service records, uncovering a series of disturbing coincidences where his attendance at major residential renovation projects coincided with unresolved missing persons reports in neighboring counties and states. The profile that emerged was that of an incredibly disciplined, compartmentalized predator who used his public reputation as a highly visible, reliable handyman to navigate the world with complete freedom, knowing that his professional standing made him completely invisible to the traditional suspicions of law enforcement, who were busy looking for drifters and criminals rather than the men fixing their neighbors' fences. In the quiet neighborhoods of Coral Gables, the initial shock of the confession began to transition into a deep, reflective sorrow, a collective realization that the city's identity had been permanently altered by the revelation of the monster in their midst. The older residents, who had lived through the terrifying, humid summer of 2004, found themselves forced to reevaluate their own memories, remembering how Vance had comforted them, how he had fixed their leaks, and how they had praised his name for bringing a sense of order to their broken houses. The profound sense of psychological violation was universal. Every family in the county felt as though a stranger had been allowed into their most sacred spaces, leaving behind a lingering sense of doubt that would take decades to fully erase from the community's collective consciousness. As the final preparations for the evidentiary hearings commenced, the courthouse square was transformed into a permanent security zone, with concrete barriers and armed guards protecting the perimeter against the continuous influx of international media and curious onlookers. The hearing process itself was expected to be a monumental challenge, as finding 12 individuals in the region who had not been exposed to the massive media coverage or who did not have a personal connection to the residential maintenance industry was nearly impossible. Yet, the prosecutors remained undeterred, determined to find a fair and impartial panel that would look past the emotional resonance of the handyman's former title and focus solely on the unyielding, mathematical truth of the forensic evidence that had finally brought an end to 36 years of darkness. On the morning of the opening statements, the security detail surrounding the estate's representatives was airtight, with state troopers lining the corridors of the courthouse and snipers positioned on the roofs of adjacent buildings to prevent any attempts at vigilante justice from a community pushed past its breaking point. As the evidentiary record was entered into the courtroom, the heavy, metallic sound of the filing cabinets being opened was the only sound that broke the absolute silence of the gallery, a rhythmic, mechanical reminder of the absolute fall from grace that had brought a modern-day predator to the bar of justice. The prosecutor stood, cleared his voice, and began to read the formal record of the confession, his words echoing through the chamber like a tolling bell, marking the definitive end of a 36-year lie and the beginning of a long, painful march toward an unyielding and absolute justice. The formal entry of the confession into the record transformed the courtroom into a space of clinical, suffocating reality, where the long-suppressed horror of the Maple Avenue backyard was finally subjected to the scrutiny of the state. The prosecution's opening presentation during this evidentiary phase did not merely outline the events of that humid August night in 2004. It provided a meticulously detailed anatomical reconstruction of a betrayal that had lasted a lifetime. As the district attorney spoke, entering the specific geographic coordinates of the burial site into the official record, a cold realization settled over the courtroom. The physical space where Elena Rodriguez had drawn her last breath was located less than 3 blocks from the elementary school where Hector Vance had volunteered his maintenance services during the summer of 2004. This proximity, the terrifying fact that the site of the horror was practically visible from the roof of the neighborhood playground, became the central focus of the investigation's expanding second phase. The Miami-Dade Police Department, now fully supported by a specialized behavioral analysis unit from the federal government, began the monumental task of deconstructing the entire residential block, which had stood as a silent, unremarkable witness to the crime for over 2 decades. The property, originally registered under a series of transient holding companies that Vance had manipulated, had been completely swallowed by the aggressive, lush Florida undergrowth, surrounded by a fortress of hibiscus and ancient palms that seemed designed to keep the world out. When forensic teams breached the perimeter of the garden, they stepped into a time capsule of absolute malice, a space where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the lingering, invisible residue of a monstrous crime. Every square inch of the backyard was subjected to intense forensic scrutiny, using high-intensity alternate light sources that could reveal biological traces invisible to the naked eye, even after 22 years of exposure to the brutal tropical elements. Technicians worked in shifting teams, their white Tyvek suits a jarring, synthetic contrast against the dark, organic loam of the soil as they recovered microscopic fibers, long-dead root patterns, and deeply embedded chemical markers that aligned perfectly with the materials found on Elena's belongings at the time of her disappearance. The methodology was slow, exhausting, and precise. Investigators used surgical scalpels to scrape individual slivers of soil from the deeper strata where the confession indicated the victim had been placed, searching for the definitive DNA profiles that would legally bind Hector Vance to that specific coordinate during those specific hours. While the forensic teams tore apart the physical structures of his past, the financial investigators were busy dismantling the complex economic empire that Vance had constructed under the guise of his maintenance business. A review of his historical service ledgers, dating back to the early 1990s, revealed a series of highly irregular cash transactions and hidden service accounts that had been used to maintain his specialized equipment and secure the absolute silence of several individuals who had gotten too close to the truth. It became evident that Vance had not just committed a murder. He had built a comprehensive logistical infrastructure designed to fund his concealment, using the tax-exempt payments from his suburban clientele to pay for the property maintenance, the heavy landscaping tools, and the eventual, long-term abandonment of his private chamber of horrors. The realization that their hard-earned money, given in faith to support the maintenance of their suburban lives, had been directly utilized to maintain the logistics of a murder investigation sent a shockwave of financial and moral outrage through Coral Gables. Class action lawsuits were initiated by former clients seeking to freeze the handyman's estate assets, paralyzing the organization's ability to pay for any posthumous legal defense and forcing his representatives to reconsider their long-term strategy. The legal team, recognizing that the estate's financial pipeline was rapidly drying up and that the public sentiment had turned into an unyielding wall of hostility, began to quietly explore the possibility of a final, binding settlement, hinting to the prosecution that they would not contest the evidentiary record if the state would agree to a formal, public acknowledgement of the victims' identities as the binding conclusion of the case. This backdoor political maneuvering, however, was met with fierce resistance from both the district attorney and the Rodriguez family, who demanded nothing less than a full, public exhibition where every detail of the handyman's depravity would be aired before a jury of his peers. David Rodriguez made it explicitly clear in a series of emotional meetings with law enforcement that his family would not accept a compromise that allowed the killer to control the narrative one last time, stating that they had already waited 22 years for justice and would rather risk a lengthy, exhausting judicial exhibition than allow Vance to bargain with the bones of their sister. The prosecution echoed this sentiment, confident that the combination of the forensic soil analysis, the recovered trophies, and the deathbed confession constituted an airtight case that no defense attorney, regardless of their skill or reputation, could successfully dismantle. As the legal teams prepared their final motions for the venue, the physical reality of Hector Vance's isolation in the hospice facility during his final days began to take a visible toll on his physical appearance and mental composure as documented in the prosecution's records. Stripped of his tools, his anonymity, and the constant, quiet routine of his daily work, he seemed to dwindle into a hollowed-out vessel of confessed malice, his voice losing its quiet, resonant quality during his final, recorded interviews. The detectives who monitored his final hours reported that he spent his nights pacing the small, clinical space of his hospital room, occasionally muttering fragments of his past deeds to the bare walls, his mind seemingly trapped in a loop of his own historical deceptions. The mask of the elegant, untouchable handyman had been completely dissolved, leaving behind a cold, frightened old man who was finally realizing that the modern world had bypassed his defenses and was about to demand a full accounting for the blood on his hands. The broader cultural impact of the Coral Gables case began to influence other law enforcement agencies across the Deep South, prompting a regional re-examination of cold cases involving young women who had disappeared near rural maintenance jobs or residential service calls during the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Miami-Dade Police Department established a dedicated multi-agency database specifically to map Hector Vance's historical service records, uncovering a series of disturbing coincidences where his attendance at major residential renovation projects coincided with unresolved missing persons reports in neighboring counties and states. The profile that emerged was that of an incredibly disciplined, compartmentalized predator who used his public reputation as a highly visible, reliable handyman to navigate the world with complete freedom, knowing that his professional standing made him completely invisible to the traditional suspicions of law enforcement, who were busy looking for drifters and criminals rather than the men fixing their neighbors' fences. In the quiet neighborhoods of Coral Gables, the initial shock of the confession began to transition into a deep, reflective sorrow, a collective realization that the city's identity had been permanently altered by the revelation of the monster in their midst. The older residents, who had lived through the terrifying, humid summer of 2004, found themselves forced to reevaluate their own memories, remembering how Vance had comforted them, how he had fixed their leaks, and how they had praised his name for bringing a sense of order to their broken houses. The profound sense of psychological violation was universal. Every family in the county felt as though a stranger had been allowed into their most sacred spaces, leaving behind a lingering sense of doubt that would take decades to fully erase from the community's collective consciousness. As the final preparations for the evidentiary hearings commenced, the courthouse square was transformed into a permanent security zone, with concrete barriers and armed guards protecting the perimeter against the continuous influx of international media and curious onlookers. The hearing process itself was expected to be a monumental challenge, as finding 12 individuals in the region who had not been exposed to the massive media coverage or who did not have a personal connection to the residential maintenance industry was nearly impossible. Yet, the prosecutors remained undeterred, determined to find a fair and impartial panel that would look past the emotional resonance of the handyman's former title and focus solely on the unyielding, mathematical truth of the forensic evidence that had finally brought an end to 22 years of darkness. On the morning of the opening statements, the security detail surrounding the state's representatives was airtight, with state troopers lining the corridors of the courthouse and snipers positioned on the roofs of adjacent buildings to prevent any attempts at vigilante justice from a community pushed past its breaking point. As the evidentiary record was entered into the courtroom, the heavy, metallic sound of the filing cabinets being opened was the only sound that broke the absolute silence of the gallery, a rhythmic, mechanical reminder of the absolute fall from grace that had brought a modern-day predator to the bar of justice. The prosecutor stood, cleared his voice, and began to read the formal record of the confession, his words echoing through the chamber like a tolling bell, marking the definitive end of a 22-year lie and the beginning of a long, painful march toward an unyielding and absolute justice. The evidentiary hearing for the state of Florida versus the estate of Hector Vance became an unprecedented study in suburban trauma, a grueling, weeks-long examination that laid bare the deep psychological fractures of a community forced to judge its own shadow dweller. Inside the temporary annex of the Coral Gables courthouse, hundreds of citizens were called forward one by one to answer a battery of questions designed to probe the depths of their personal trust, their daily routines, and their memories of the humid August of 2004. It quickly became apparent that finding individuals who had not been directly touched by Hector Vance's decades of residential maintenance was a near impossible task. Some potential jurors broke down in tears on the witness stand, confessing that Vance had repaired their daughter's bedroom locks, fixed their kitchen pipes, or spent years maintaining the very fences that were meant to keep their families safe. Others expressed a burning, volatile anger that disqualified them immediately, their testimonies reflecting the collective rage of a neighborhood that had realized their sanctuary was built on a foundation of hidden graves. As the legal teams haggled over the composition of the evidentiary panel, the prosecution's investigative apparatus continued to dig into the dark history of the Maple Avenue property, uncovering a series of physical and digital anomalies that pointed toward an even greater level of premeditation than previously assumed. Forensic analysts examining the structure's foundation discovered that the backyard had been fitted with an independent, subterranean drainage system that was completely separate from the municipal grid, a setup that allowed Vance to manage the groundwater levels in his secondary burial shafts without ever alerting the utility companies or creating a paper trail of soil disruption. Furthermore, a deep architectural dive into the backyard's layout revealed a reinforced concrete storm cellar beneath the shed floorboards, a space that had been meticulously soundproofed with heavy layers of industrial insulation and thick, water-resistant acoustic tiling. The discovery of this subterranean chamber shifted the entire legal narrative from a case of a sudden, impulsive act of violence to a terrifying depiction of a highly organized, long-term operational base for a predator. Inside the dark, damp cellar, where the air had remained stagnant and freezing for over 2 decades, forensic technicians using specialized chemical enhancement sprays uncovered old, heavy iron restraints bolted directly into the concrete foundation, along with fragments of audio tape and discarded batteries that suggested Vance had not merely held his victims there, but had actively documented their suffering for his own private torment. The sheer, industrial scale of the concealment sent a wave of nausea through the prosecution team, confirming their worst suspicions that Elena Rodriguez had been the victim of a man who had treated his criminal activities with the same meticulous, cold-blooded attention to detail that he applied to the construction of a backyard deck. Outside the legal arena, the financial collapse of the Vance estate was total and absolute, as the executor of his meager will, facing ruinous liabilities and a complete abandonment by the community, voted to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. The simple, unremarkable house on Maple Avenue, which had once been a source of immense suburban comfort for the families who had lived there, was officially locked by court order, its sweeping lawn empty, its once manicured hedges beginning to overgrow with weeds as the funds for maintenance completely dried up. The spectacle of the abandoned property stood as a massive, silent monument to the hypocrisy that had defiled the community, a physical manifestation of a suburban nightmare that had been built on a foundation of blood, lies, and the stolen trust of thousands of working-class families who had hired Vance to maintain their homes. For the surviving members of the Rodriguez family, the impending start of the evidentiary exhibition was a period of intense, suffocating tension as they prepared themselves to face the evidence of the man who had orchestrated their lifelong agony in an open courtroom. David Rodriguez spent his evenings huddled with the victim assistance coordinators, reviewing the graphic nature of the evidence that would be presented to the public, steeling himself for the moment when the prosecution would display the enhanced photographs and the physical artifacts recovered from the shed floorboards. He knew that the estate's representatives would do everything in their power to dehumanize his sister, to suggest that she had put herself in danger, or to twist her memory in a desperate attempt to create a shadow of reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. But David remained unyielding, his resolve hardened by decades of unanswered questions, determined to stand as a wall of living memory for a sister who had been silenced before she ever had the chance to live her life. Inside the high-security wing of the county evidence locker, Hector Vance's physical legacy was characterized by a chilling, sociopathic detachment that deeply disturbed the guards assigned to catalog his possessions. Stripped of his tools, his anonymity, and the constant adulation of the families he served, the physical evidence of his crimes was reduced to an unremarkable collection of plastic bags and sterile, labeled containers. The detectives who monitored the processing of his shed reported that it felt as though they were cataloging the contents of a serial killer's museum, their work characterized by the cold, metallic routine of institutional cataloging, their minds trapped in a loop of their own historical failures. The mask of the elegant, untouchable handyman had been completely dissolved, leaving behind a cold, frightened, and now-deceased old man who was finally realizing that the modern world had bypassed his defenses and was about to demand a full accounting for the blood on his hands. The regional impact of the case continued to widen as law enforcement agencies in Broward, Palm Beach, and Collier counties began cross-referencing their own historical cold cases with Hector Vance's service records from the late 1990s, realizing that his network of residential contacts gave him access to vulnerable communities across the state. The Miami-Dade Police Department established a dedicated hotline for former clients of Vance's, receiving hundreds of calls from individuals who described a pattern of professional intrusion, intimidation, and secret financial transactions that had been covered up by a small inner circle of contractors who had prioritized the protection of their industry over the safety of the public. This expanding web of corruption suggested that Vance had not operated in a total vacuum, but had relied on a culture of absolute indifference and suburban isolation that prevented anyone from investigating his private life or questioning the sudden disappearances that seemed to follow in his wake. As the final 12 jurors and 2 alternates were finally sworn in, a heavy, expectant silence settled over the city of Miami, a collective realization that the long-delayed reckoning was finally about to begin. The national media outlets had constructed elaborate broadcasting platforms in the streets surrounding the courthouse, their high-powered lights illuminating the historic brick facade throughout the night, turning the quiet Florida city into the center of a global true crime phenomenon. The local business owners closed their shops early on the eve of the evidentiary hearing, wanting no part in the media circus, preferring instead to gather in their homes to watch the coverage in private, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their city's name would forever be linked to the exposure of a master of suburban deception. On the morning of the opening statements, the security detail surrounding the courthouse was airtight, with state troopers lining the corridors of the building and snipers positioned on the roofs of adjacent structures to prevent any attempts at vigilante justice from a community pushed past its breaking point. As the evidentiary record was presented to the jury, the heavy clinking of the filing cabinets was the only sound that broke the absolute silence of the gallery, a rhythmic, metallic reminder of the absolute fall from grace that had brought a modern-day predator to the bar of justice. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling the rooms he stepped into, and he was now approaching his own posthumous trial not as a penitent sinner seeking forgiveness, but as a ghost preparing for a final, desperate stand against an overwhelming enemy. The jury returned to their seats after the first day of evidence with faces that had been drained of all color, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor to avoid the glare of the cameras and the burning, furious gazes of the people he had deceived for a lifetime. The prosecutor stood, cleared his voice, and began to read the formal charges, his words echoing through the chamber like a tolling bell, marking the definitive end of a 22-year lie and the beginning of a long, painful march toward an unyielding and absolute justice. Every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented, and every image projected on the screen served to reinforce the terrible reality of the handyman's career, leaving the jurors in no doubt as to the extent of his violence and the scale of his calculated, lifelong deception. The trial, once a question of suburban suspicion, was now a definitive, historical record of a man who had turned the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Coral Gables into a hunting ground for the vulnerable, and the evidence against him was nothing short of a tidal wave of biological and logistical truth that could not be stopped. The opening statements of the state of Florida v. The estate of Hector Vance commenced under a sky as heavy and gray as the concrete walls of the Miami-Dade courthouse. Inside room 302, every wooden bench groaned under the weight of an audience wrapped in collective, breathless anticipation. The prosecution did not waste time with grand metaphors or emotional appeals. Instead, the lead state attorney walked directly to the center of the courtroom floor, placed a single, pristine white plastic bag containing a fragment of soil from the Maple Avenue backyard onto the evidence table, and turned to face the jury. For 45 minutes, his voice remained low, measured, and devastatingly precise, mapping out a direct, unvarnished timeline that connected the organic decay unearthed in the summer of 2026 to the violent struggle that occurred in the damp, tropical undergrowth of Coral Gables on August 14, 2004. He told the jury that the state would not ask them to judge a man's reputation, nor would they ask them to evaluate his 2 decades of suburban maintenance service. They would simply ask them to look at the mathematics of soil stratification, an infallible, chemical ledger that time could neither alter nor corrupt. When the estate's representatives rose to present their opening statement, the strategy became immediately clear. They were going to put the passage of time itself on trial. The lead attorney, a veteran trial lawyer from Orlando with a reputation for dismantling complex state cases, did not try to argue that Hector Vance was a man of perfect virtue. Instead, He walked the jury through the chaotic, low-tech reality of municipal law enforcement in 2004. He painted a picture of open-air crime scenes, cardboard boxes stored in leaky municipal basements, and decades of shifting personnel, suggesting that the microscopic biological markers found in the Maple Avenue soil were the result of environmental contamination, handled by dozens of police officers who had forgotten to wear protective equipment, or worse, planted by a modern task force desperate to close a high-profile cold case at any cost. He looked the jurors in the eyes and asked them if they were truly willing to condemn the legacy of an elderly, deceased man based on a science that didn't even exist when the crime was committed, relying on a chain of custody that was full of holes, gaps, and forgotten names. The state's first witness was retired Detective Maria Santos, the woman who had first arrived at the scene of Elena Rodriguez's abandoned property on the morning of August 15, 2004. Santos, now 78 years old and walking with the assistance of a cane, spoke with a voice that trembled with the weight of a lifelong regret. As the prosecution projected the original, faded color photographs of the crime scene onto the large screens inside the courtroom, Santos walked the jury through those initial, critical hours. She described the overgrown garden, the discarded construction tools found near the fence line, and the eerie, untouched nature of the backyard where Hector Vance had been working just hours before the disappearance. The prosecution carefully guided Santos's testimony to establish the pristine condition of the site before the secondary contamination of the municipal search, demonstrating that the site had been specifically chosen by Vance to facilitate the rapid concealment of evidence. The cross-examination of the aging detective was a brutal, clinical exercise in modern defense tactics. The defense attorney relentlessly targeted Santos's memory, forcing her to admit that she could not remember the exact humidity levels on that morning, nor could she recall every single civilian volunteer who had walked near the property line during the initial search frenzy. The attorney produced old, yellowed police logs showing that the evidence room in the old downtown precinct had suffered a massive roof leak during a hurricane in 2005, forcing Santos to acknowledge that boxes of evidence had been moved by hand, under chaotic conditions, without formal documentation of who handled which item. The defense was trying to create a sense of historical static, a cloud of dust and ancient mistakes designed to obscure the sharp, clear signal of the modern soil chemistry match. But the prosecution was prepared for this strategy, and their next series of witnesses was designed to build a bridge of absolute scientific certainty over the defense's swamp of doubt. They called to the stand Dr. Juliana Rossi, the forensic soil scientist who had first directed the deep core excavation of the Maple Avenue site. Dr. Rossi, a calm, authoritative woman with decades of experience in high-profile environmental criminal investigations, used clear, accessible language to explain the process of pathological fingerprinting to the jury. She explained how modern chemical sequencing techniques can isolate individual mineral signatures trapped inside the tightly packed clay and organic matter of a backyard, separating the perpetrator's deliberate burial disturbances from any superficial environmental shifting that might have occurred decades later. Using a massive digital chart that filled the front wall of the courtroom, Dr. Rossi demonstrated how she had taken the soil samples from the secondary burial shaft and analyzed their isotope ratios, tracking the chemical matches to the specific concrete foundation additives Vance had used during his construction of the storm cellar. The jury watched in absolute fascination as she showed how the layers of earth naturally preserved the chronological order of the burial, effectively acting as a permanent, subterranean recording device that had been activated the moment the hole was dug and sealed in 2004. The scientific precision of her testimony acted like a cold compress on the emotional tension of the room, grounding the trial in the unyielding laws of geochemistry and thermodynamics. The trial took a distinctly dark and unsettling turn when the state introduced the evidence recovered from the secret, soundproof cellar. The prosecution called to the stand the federal tactical agent who had breached the shed, forcing the jury to confront the mundane, everyday reality of how the trap had been built and maintained. The agent described removing the heavy, water-resistant acoustic tiling from the walls, revealing the crude, hand-driven iron bolts that had been used to secure the restraints to the foundation. The contrast between the handyman's quiet, professional life and the horrific, subterranean chamber of torture was jarring, highlighting the chilling, sociopathic compartmentalization that had allowed Hector Vance to live a double life for 22 years without ever showing a single sign of guilt or remorse. As the DNA profile from the soil surrounding the burial shaft was officially entered into evidence, showing a perfect, undeniable match with the biological material found on Elena Rodriguez's clothing, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the defense table. The estate's representatives sat perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the digital display, their faces a tight, pale mask that refused to give away the panic that must have been rising within them. They were representing a man who had spent his entire life utilizing his professional status, his quiet manner, and his manual skill to control the people around him, but they were now facing an adversary that could not be preached to, could not be manipulated, and could not be forgiven through a display of posthumous professional legacy. The science was cold, indifferent, and absolute, and it was systematically stripping away his armor, piece by piece, before the eyes of the community he had deceived for 22 years. The prosecution then called their final forensic witness, a linguistic expert who had analyzed the syntax and vocabulary of Vance's deathbed confession. The expert testified that the confession was not a confused or drug-addled hallucination, but a highly structured, coherent narrative that contained specific, verifiable details about the placement of the remains and the hidden tools in the shed that had never been released to the public. He explained that the confession contained a level of specific, anatomical awareness that only a primary actor could have provided, effectively locking the estate into a corner where they could not argue that the handyman had been rambling or out of touch with reality when he spoke his final, damning truths. The linguistic analysis solidified the state's case, removing the final shred of ambiguity and ensuring that the confession would be viewed by the jury as a cold, deliberate act of final accountability, leaving the defense with no remaining arguments other than a desperate, pathetic appeal to a mercy that had already been permanently exhausted. The trial reached a psychological tipping point as the prosecution moved from the cold, chemical reality of the soil to the visceral, human cost of Hector Vance's decades of calculated deception. When the courtroom doors opened for the seventh day of proceedings, the air felt thin, charged with a collective memory of the city's long-standing grief. The prosecution had laid bare the methodology of the handyman, but now they intended to unveil the interior world of his victims. They called to the stand Dr. Elena Thorne, a clinical psychologist specializing in the long-term impact of serial predatory behavior on suburban environments. Her presence signaled a shift. The state was no longer just proving that Vance committed the crimes, but explaining how he had successfully weaponized the very nature of suburban trust to hold an entire community hostage in plain sight. Dr. Thorne's testimony was a masterclass in behavioral architecture. She used a series of structural maps to demonstrate how Vance had utilized his professional role as a handyman to create a perimeter of invisibility. By gaining access to hundreds of homes, he had been able to perform a constant, silent surveillance on the most vulnerable members of the community. She explained to the jury that for a predator like Vance, the act of repair was a secondary objective. The primary objective was the acquisition of information. He knew the layout of the bedrooms, the timing of the residents' arrivals, and the location of the security blind spots in every house he serviced. He had turned the Coral Gables landscape into a chessboard where he held all the pieces, and where his victims were walking through a gauntlet of his own creation without ever sensing the danger. The prosecution then displayed a sequence of photographs recovered from Vance's storage unit, photographs not of his victims, but of their houses. The jury watched as the screen cycled through dozens of images of suburban facades, each one marked with handwritten notes in Vance's margin, dates, times, and observations about the residents' habits. It was a catalog of intrusion. The jury could see the chilling reality of his process. He was not a man who acted on sudden impulse, but a man who lived in a permanent state of predatory preparation. The sheer, methodical nature of his documentation caused an audible stir in the gallery, as jurors who had once lived in the neighborhood realized that any one of them could have been the next entry in his ledger. The defense team tried to argue that this was merely the professional record-keeping of an industrious handyman, but the argument withered under the weight of the sheer, morbid focus revealed in the notes. To emphasize the impact of this intrusion, the state called to the stand 3 former clients of Hector Vance, 3 women who had hired him for major projects between 2002 and 2004. Each of them spoke with a trembling, hesitant voice, describing how Vance's presence in their homes had often felt off, how he had a habit of lingering, of asking personal questions about their families, and of appearing in rooms where he had no professional business being. Their testimonies did not focus on overt threats, but on the accumulation of small, unsettling boundary violations that had made them feel vulnerable in their own living rooms. They spoke of the deep, enduring sense of guilt they had carried for years, blaming themselves for not having perceived the monster behind the repairman's uniform, a guilt that the prosecution used to drive home the point that Vance's primary tool was not the hammer in his hand, but the misplaced, societal instinct to trust a familiar, working-class face. The courtroom became a space of profound, shared mourning as the state introduced the final, tragic component of the evidentiary record, the personal effects recovered from the secondary burial sites. The prosecution had requested that the jury view these items not as evidence, but as pieces of a stolen life. They were placed on a series of velvet-lined trays, a pair of small, delicate earrings, a hand-stitched doll, a high school graduation medallion. Each piece was linked to a specific victim, and as the bailiff moved the trays slowly past the jury box, the atmosphere in the room grew heavy with the weight of the stories that were being told through these abandoned, broken objects. David Rodriguez, sitting in the front row, kept his gaze fixed on the tray containing his sister's jewelry, his face a testament to the decades of loss that were finally being acknowledged in a court of law. The defense attorney attempted to disrupt this emotional trajectory by filing a series of aggressive motions, claiming that the introduction of the victim's personal items was designed solely to inflame the passions of the jury and had no legal relevance to the forensic facts of the case. He stood before the judge, his face red with frustration, arguing that the state was conducting a theatrical trial rather than a judicial one. But the judge, in a rare, stern rebuke, dismissed the motions, stating that the personal effects were vital to understanding the context of the crimes that involved the theft of not just a life, but an entire existence. The courtroom remained focused on the trays, the items serving as a silent, heartbreaking indictment of the man who had thought he could bury his victims and keep their belongings as a private, twisted collection. The state then pivoted to the forensic anthropology report, inviting Dr. Thorne back to the stand to discuss the findings from the secondary burial sites that had been unearthed in the previous weeks. She detailed how the soil chemistry had been altered by the presence of organic decomposition, creating ghost prints in the ground that had allowed the team to reconstruct the exact positions in which the victims had been placed. The scientific detail was agonizingly specific. The way the burial shafts had been dug to avoid the root systems of the garden, the precision with which the victims had been oriented, all pointing to a perpetrator who wanted to ensure that his actions remained hidden until the end of time. It was an exercise in systematic erasure, a man trying to turn his victims into nothing more than chemical markers in the earth, and the jury sat in stunned silence as the scale of his intent was laid bare. As the day's testimony drew to a close, the district attorney made a final, powerful connection. He asked Dr. Thorne to look at the photos of the burial sites again and compare them to the service logs of Vance's maintenance jobs during the same weeks. The result was a chilling, perfectly calibrated timeline. Vance would work on a house, finish his task, and then, in the dead of the night, return to the earth to attend to his garden of secrets. The cycle was relentless, a terrifying, professional commitment to the work of murder that had gone completely uninterrupted for years. The jury was left with the undeniable conclusion that for Hector Vance, the maintenance of his hidden burial sites had become his primary profession, a dark, private duty that had occupied the vast majority of his adult life. When the judge finally adjourned the proceedings for the evening, the exodus from the courthouse was slow, silent, and somber. The usual noise of the city outside felt jarring and dissonant, a world that was still turning even though the secrets of Coral Gables had finally been dragged into the light. People who had been watching the trial walked to their cars with their heads bowed, processing the realization that the man who had fixed their fences and repaired their leaks had been a shadow in the soil all along. The seventh day of the trial had effectively stripped away the last, desperate illusions of the estate's representatives, leaving them with no path forward other than to accept that their client's life had been a masterpiece of deception, one that was now being taken apart piece by digital, biological, and chemical piece, before the final, historical verdict of the law. The eighth phase of the trial marked a terrifying descent into the behavioral architecture of the crime, moving the courtroom past the physical evidence of anatomy and into the chillingly cold, operational timeline of the cover-up. When the court reconvened on Monday morning for the start of the third week, the public gallery was so packed that federal marshals had to establish an overflow room on the first floor to accommodate the hundreds of citizens, journalists, and legal scholars who had arrived before dawn. The prosecution had successfully locked Hector Vance to the crime scene through forensic soil stratification, video surveillance, and deathbed confessions. Now, their objective was to demonstrate the immense, calculating consciousness of guilt that followed the murder, revealing a 22-year pattern of economic intimidation and systematic obstruction that turned a simple handyman into an active instrument of criminal concealment. The lead district attorney called to the stand a witness whose name had been kept under the strictest security protocols throughout the entire pretrial discovery process. Marcus Lynn, a 68-year-old former local contractor who had worked alongside Vance in the early 2000s before abruptly moving to a remote rural town in the Florida Panhandle. Lynn walked with a slow, hesitant step, his eyes darting anxiously around the high-ceilinged room before settling on the clerk as he took the oath. His voice, thin and strained by decades of self-imposed isolation, carried a raw, emotional vulnerability that stood in sharp contrast to the cold, clinical experts who had preceded him. Lynn testified that in August of 2004, his primary professional relationship with Vance was built on shared equipment and occasional collaborative labor for high-end suburban renovations. He told the jury that on the morning of August 16, 2004, less than 48 hours after Elena Rodriguez had vanished, he had arrived at Vance's property to pick up a shared power tiller. He found the backyard in a state of chaotic transition. Vance was obsessively rearranging the landscaping around the old oak tree, using heavy equipment to create an intricate, terraced garden layout that seemed, even to Lynn, to be entirely unnecessary for the property's size. The prosecution carefully guided Lynn's testimony, projecting a series of digitized property photos taken from a 2004 satellite survey. Lynn pointed out the specific alterations to the garden, noting that Vance had been working with a level of frantic, physical intensity that was entirely uncharacteristic of his usual, slow-paced professional demeanor. He testified that he was instructed by Vance to leave immediately and not return for several days, an order that was accompanied by an uncharacteristically sharp, threatening tone that stayed with Lynn for years. The prosecution entered into evidence Lynn's handwritten invoice records from that week, showing that Vance had paid him a substantial, unexplained bonus, effectively a hush money payment, to avoid the Maple Avenue site during the days the secondary burial shafts were being fortified. The courtroom collective held its breath as the prosecutor opened a specific, forensic reconstruction file that had been built based on Lynn's testimony. The file displayed a detailed, tactical analysis of the garden's landscaping plan, revealing how Vance had utilized specific plant species, specifically dense, fast-growing hedge varieties, not for aesthetic appeal, but to act as a permanent, impenetrable barrier against any future, accidental soil disturbance. The memo, reconstructed from the evidence, outlined a strategic plan to manipulate the yard's drainage to ensure that any settling of the earth would be masked by natural erosion patterns. The visualization of this domestic manipulation, the sheer, unvarnished arrogance of using professional landscaping techniques to bury a murder victim while Elena's family was still printing flyers for her search, sent a visible wave of fury through the jury box. Several jurors could be seen leaning forward, their faces hardened into expressions of pure, unmitigated contempt as they stared at the image of the garden. The estate's legal team remained completely motionless, their hands folded tightly on their lap, their chins pressed against their chests as if they could simply block out the electronic records of their client's corrupt career. Lynn's testimony took an even more devastating turn when he described a private confrontation that occurred inside Vance's work shed in late September of 2004. He told the jury that he had inadvertently stumbled upon a collection of personal effects belonging to Elena Rodriguez, including her nursing student identification card and a distinctive, silver-trimmed book bag, sitting openly on a workbench amidst a collection of discarded, stained rags. Lynn testified that when he confronted Vance about the items, the handyman did not offer an explanation, nor did he display a single shred of panic. Instead, Vance walked over to the workbench, picked up the identification card, and told Lynn in a quiet, flat voice that was entirely devoid of human empathy that some individuals were merely transient, unfortunate accidents of the city, and that those who knew how to clean up properly were the only ones who truly dictated the terms of their own survival. Within 48 hours of that conversation, Lynn had abandoned his partnership with Vance, sold his equipment at a significant loss, and relocated to the northern reaches of the state, living in a constant state of hypervigilance that he had maintained for 22 years. He testified that his silence was not the result of a mental delusion, but the direct, rational consequence of knowing that he had spent his youth working alongside a cold-blooded killer who possessed the physical strength, the professional tools, and the absolute lack of morality required to make an inconvenient witness vanish without a trace. His testimony completely exposed the suburban mechanics of the concealment, demonstrating to the jury that the 22-year wall of silence surrounding Elena Rodriguez's death was not an accident of history or a failure of police work, but a meticulously maintained, professional product designed, built, and fortified by Hector Vance to protect his dark, subterranean vault from the unyielding scales of human justice. The cross-examination of the former associate was a brutal, scorched-earth exercise in modern defense tactics. The lead attorney stood close to the witness stand, aggressively targeting Lynn's psychological history and pointing out that he had been treated for severe clinical depression in the years following his departure from the city. He suggested that Lynn was a bitter, disgruntled former partner who had spent 2 decades magnifying routine professional disagreements into a spectacular, manufactured criminal conspiracy to justify his own career failures and secure a sense of historical importance in a high-profile case. But Lynn did not break under the intense legal pressure. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice suddenly regaining its structural strength, and stated with absolute clarity that his mental health struggles were not the result of a personal failure, but the direct, rational consequence of knowing that he had witnessed a crime that had been systematically scrubbed from the world by a man who had continued to walk the streets of Coral Gables with a hammer in his hand. His testimony completely exposed the mechanics of the concealment, demonstrating to the jury that the handyman had used the professional culture of silence and the mundane nature of the service industry to ensure that no one would ever look twice at a grave dug beneath a garden. The prosecution followed Lynn's testimony by calling a series of former neighbors who had lived on Maple Avenue in 2004. These individuals described the garden renovation phase of Vance's life as a period of profound, unexplained unease. One neighbor testified that her family had been woken up in the middle of the night by the low, rhythmic hum of heavy machinery, a tiller and a backhoe, operating in Vance's backyard. She described watching through her kitchen window as he worked under the beams of portable, high-intensity construction lights, his movements robotic and tireless, his silhouette moving back and forth across the yard in a way that had felt, even then, deeply, instinctively wrong. The testimony from the neighbors confirmed that Vance's work had not been limited to the light of day. He had been a nocturnal gardener, a man who had dedicated his sleeping hours to the maintenance of his hidden burial ground. The prosecution introduced a series of high-resolution satellite thermal scans taken from a 2004 weather research flight, showing a distinct, localized heat signature rising from the backyard burial site during the early hours of August 17, 2004. Heat that was generated not by the sun, but by the physical, biological processes that had only just begun beneath the surface of the soil. The jury was left with the undeniable conclusion that for Hector Vance, the maintenance of his hidden burial sites had been a primary, professional commitment, a dark, private duty that had occupied the vast majority of his adult life. The trial, once a question of suburban suspicion, was now a definitive, historical record of a man who had turned the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Coral Gables into a hunting ground for the vulnerable, and the evidence against him was nothing short of a tidal wave of biological and logistical truth that could not be stopped. When the judge finally adjourned the proceedings for the evening, the exodus from the courthouse was slow, silent, and somber. The people who had been watching the trial walked to their cars with their heads bowed, processing the realization that the man who had fixed their fences and repaired their leaks had been a shadow in the soil all along, and that the quiet, unremarkable handyman had been the architect of a suburban horror story that had been written in the dark, buried in the clay, and finally, after 22 years, read aloud in the halls of the law.